climate change, forests, food security, and the role of forests therein. Forests and these global problems is not only a story of deforestation, forests also have a potentially positive, perhaps very positive, role to play in mitigating some of these problems that we face. This is an extraordinary session in that we have 15 speakers plus me squeezed into originally 90 minutes, probably more like 75, 80 minutes now. So it's a sort of speed dialogue. And I will try to keep us to time. So all of our speakers and panelists, please make your key points succinctly and crisply, and we'll all be the better for it. And we'll see how much we can get through. There may be a few casualties of this time pressure. But with no more ado, let me please introduce to you someone who I'm sure you know, Maria Elena Semedo. She's the Deputy Director General of the FAO. She's the CPF Chair, and she's going to kick us off with some introductory thoughts. Thanks very much, Maria.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all, fellow heads of the CPF agencies, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, dear participants, friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you at this event organized by the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. It is extremely important for us to be here together as the forest community to discuss and scale up actions to tackle today's global challenges. The frequency and intensity of the impacts of climate change, conflicts, and other humanitarian emergencies have increased over the last years at all levels in all parts of the world, hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. According to FAO, hunger is on the rise, affecting 800 million people globally in 2020, an increase of around 118 million compared to 2019. Our global population is growing. We must also think about the additional 2 billion people we'll have to feed by 2050. Today, we'll discuss how forests contribute to the solution pathways in responding to these global challenges. Earlier today, FAO launched a new flagship report, The State of the World's Forest 2022. It presents 3 mutually reinforcing pathways to achieve sustainable, healthy forests and society. And the first pathway is halting deforestation and maintaining forests. The second is restoring degraded lands and expanding agroforestry. And the third is sustainably using forests and building green value chains. No matter the crises we face, a pandemic, conflicts, climate change, biodiversity loss, and resulting economic recession and food insecurity, we must consider our forests and our natural resources as part of the solution and integrate them in recovery plans and strategies. It is time the world invests in forests through bold policies, increased finance, information, data, technologies, and good practices. We have no time to lose. According to the FAO's Global Forest Resource Assessment, we have losing forests at the rate of 10 million hectares each year through deforestation. We must all work harder to halt deforestation and unsustainable consumption and restore degraded land so that forest ecosystem can continue providing their multiple services on which each one of us depends. FAO, together with UNDP, UNEP, and other partners, supports more than 60 countries to implement strategies to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. FAO promotes sustainable consumption and production patterns at all levels. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, co-led by FAO and UNEP, is a unique opportunity to accelerate and transform innovative ideas into ambitious action on the ground. This requires policy coherence, effective and inclusive governance, and the use of appropriate policy tools that address the underlying causes of unsustainable practices and existing inequalities. To achieve this, we need to work together. The Collaborative Partnership on Forests, consisting of 15 international organizations working on forest issues, is well placed to support member countries to drive real change. I look forward to this panel discussion as we explore solutions offered by forests to tackle climate change, conflicts, and food insecurity. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maria Elena, for those thoughts. Let me introduce our panel to you, ladies and gentlemen, albeit that we're going to leap from the panel to a video, back to the panel, but let's know who we have on the stage first. To the left of Maria Elena, where currently there's a space, there will soon be Robert Nassi, who's the Director General of C4 and the Vice Chair of the CPF. To the notional Robert's left is Sham Satkaro, the Executive Director of ITTO. Tony Simons, Executive Director of C4 ICRAF, is to Sham's left. And then John Perota, who's the President of the IUFRO, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. To the left of John is Gertrude Kabusimbi Kenyangi, who's the Executive Director of Support for Women in Agriculture and Environment, Kenyan NGO. And to Gertrude's left is a representative of youth organizations in this sphere, Abdullah Al-Maroof, who is from Bangladesh, and of the International Association of Students in Agricultural and Related Scientists. Panel, we're really honored and pleased to have you with us. Thanks very much indeed. Again, all in the name of speed, I just want to rip down the panel before we have our first video. We know that we're focusing our thoughts around food security, conflict, and climate change. Could I just ask you all, starting with Maria Elena, to tell me which part of that you most want to speak to in your remarks? And it could be all three, and you probably won't get an opportunity to, but I'd love to hear where your enthusiasm lies.
Me, I would like to talk about a world with less hunger, less poverty, more inclusiveness, and with green and healthier planet.
Food security then, should we say?
For sure, with less hunger is food security.
Sham.
Thank you, James. If Helena's talking on those, I'll go for the holistic approach, coherence, international collaboration, and wood security.
Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Tony.
I would go for interdependencies of forest with other sectors and systems, and the fact that governments cannot do it alone.
Thank you very much indeed. John.
Well, being a conflict avoider all my life, I think it's time for me to change my tune. I'll focus on conflicts.
Okay, very good. Look forward to that. Gertrude.
Yeah, I'd like to bring the perspectives of forest-dependent indigenous peoples and local communities into that discourse.
Thank you, Gertrude. Abdullah.
So on today's discussion, I would like to bring some youth perspective to bring back the nature as it looked like 50 years ago and preserve it not as a stories for my grandchildren.
Okay, thank you all very much. I hope you're warmed up a little bit. We're now going to have some thoughts from Achim Steiner of UNDP, head honcho of UNDP, by video, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It is a privilege to join this collaborative partnership on forest dialogue during the World Forestry Congress. As countries across the world seek to join the Great Reset in the wake of COVID-19, pinpointing new ways to conserve and restore forests is critical. The forest and land use sector can provide up to 1/3 of the emissions reductions needed to mitigate the most severe impacts of climate change. Forests also bring a range of additional development biodiversity benefits, including cleaning water and air, decreasing soil erosion and flood risks, and securing wildlife habitats and fisheries, as many of you know and have demonstrated for so many years. As reaffirmed through the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use, which was endorsed by over 140 countries and covers approximately 90% of global forests, we need swift action and strengthened political commitment to end global deforestation by the end of this decade. To do this, we need to directly address the drivers of deforestation. At the United Nations Development Programme, we are actively contributing to key global programs and partnerships like the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, the Forest Declaration Platform, and the UN REDD Programme. Alongside our partners, we are helping countries to find new solutions and scale up efforts related to the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of forests. For instance, consider Ecuador, where UNDP is currently supporting the implementation of the Pro-Amazonia, the country's integrated program on forest conservation and sustainable production. It aims to demonstrate the potential of a deforestation-free model to itself and the world. That includes providing tailored support to producers of coffee and cocoa, helping them to become more sustainable. This groundbreaking program is made possible thanks to the support from the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. UNDP is also supporting 120 countries to enhance and implement their nationally determined contributions through our Climate Promise initiative, still the world's largest offer of its kind. Countries such as Nigeria, Honduras, and Cambodia are using their NDCs to drive forward bold deforestation efforts, including through REDD+. Indeed, 92% of NDCs now include clear references to forests and other land uses, and 60% actually have quantifiable targets. We must now support countries to realize these ambitious targets in the context of their broader development objectives. For instance, look to a new partnership between the United Kingdom and UNDP. It will support up to 8 countries to increase ambition and accelerate the implementation of their forest, land, and nature targets under the Paris Agreement. And crucially, we need to unlock new sources of finance. As part of our strategic plan, UNDP aims to contribute to mobilizing over $1 trillion of investment in the Sustainable Development Goals, including towards the protection and restoration of forests over the next 4 years. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at this global inflection point, initiatives like the Collaborative Partnership on Forests are essential to translate global ambition into game-changing grassroots action led by local communities. As ever, UNDP and the UN family are committed to working with our many partners to co-invest in the future of our forests. Doing so will improve the health and well-being of people and planet. And perhaps most importantly, it will unleash a literal force of nature in our efforts to tackle climate change. Finally, let me wish you a most productive session. Thank you.
Thoughts from Achim Steiner. Following up, Maria Elena, on your opening, thoughts on food security, insecurity. Clearly, this is suddenly a topical issue again. We're seeing interruptions in the export of grains from Ukraine and Russia, major grains exporters to North Africa especially, which is shadowed by climate change and the prospect of drought. And we're seeing huge inflation in grain prices as a result of that. So there's a bit of topical context. What, in your opinion, is the potential role of forests in addressing food security, insecurity?
Thank you, and I fully agree with you. If you look at the figures, as I said, 2019, we had 800 million people, 2020. These 800 million might have increased by 150 million due to COVID-19. And when we think about 2022, with the conflict in Ukraine, with the price of energy and the price of fertilizer, it will be higher. And with consequences. It's a consequences because if we have food insecurity, for sure it linked to poverty. And we know also that one of the drivers of deforestation is poverty. Forests contribute to the livelihoods of people, contribute to jobs increase. And if we have more people food insecure, we'll go to increase deforestation. Then that forests can be a solution to improve food security and increase green jobs. And we have also the service provided by forests. What Akim just mentioned, forests provide water for people. If we also have less deforestation, maybe if you have more sustainable agriculture, we'll have less deforestation and vice versa. This is also another contribution that forestry can bring. We have also how we can enhance forest contribution to food security. One, we have talked today about the whole of indigenous people. Indigenous people can, if they have the right to land, to territories, they can contribute to food security. We can increase food security in cities, how we can greener the cities, how we can produce how can I say, in the vertical way, produce food in cities and contribute to food security and maybe reduce deforestation. And we need to transition to sustainable agriculture practices which help us to conserve and preserve biodiversity. It has been referred today, the link between forestry and the conserved biodiversity. Our species are disappearing through biodiversity. But if you have better biodiversity, we can also have diversity of food. We can use maybe some of the species and the varieties we are not using, but they exist, and indigenous people are showing us that they exist and they can be used. Meaning that forests can be multifunctional, contributing to food security and the services they provide, the food they can provide, and how they can contribute to reduce poverty. And naturally, if you have less poverty, we are not deforestation.
Thank you very much for that, Maria Elena. I guess that's a very compelling conceptual view of the problem and potential solution. But when we're talking about crisis mode, about drought, about food insecurity as a result of broken supply chains or indeed conflict, which may be near, not far, is it realistic to think that forests could play these roles, or are forests just going to get hammered by these problems? And what's the mechanism that could, the key, of course, you know, this is a complicated problem, but what's the key mechanism that would allow forests to play this positive role? What do you need? Do you need effective government? Do you need effective local government? Just one comment on that.
We need government and governance, because forestry needs governance. The role of the local communities is important. We need policies, we need finance, and we need data. Data is important for us to monitor and to know what is happening. That's why we launched the SOFO today. We launched the FRA, the Forest Resource Assessment, which give us the information. Maybe deforestation is decreasing, but not at the pace and the speed we need. Though all of those are important. And we cannot say one, I can say it's a package.
I understand. There's never one simple answer. I just wanted to connect the concept to the reality, which is always the stretch. Sham, this is a nice kind of segue, because we go from broken supply chains around food to supply chains as far as timber is concerned and other forest products, perhaps, if you like. Could you speak to that? What's the situation currently?
Yes, of course, and I presume you mean as a result of the pandemic, James, or?
Mostly, yes.
Mostly, right. Thank you. So for the last 2 years, at the initial stage of the pandemic, it had not yet hit the timber and forest supply chains, not as acutely as it has built up over the last year and a half. So what we have seen in the last couple of years is, as of now, there are issues of fractured supply chains, naturally, due to the inconsistency of some markets opening up and some markets locking down, and some other markets, operating in a half and half, in a 50-50 hybrid manner, which still disturbed the actual flow of products from the forest through the processing industry, which again got badly affected by COVID, either lockdowns or movement restrictions even. Monitoring in the forest areas, project implementation also was affected. I mean, this is from ITTO's personal experience. This is what we found, because a number of our projects had to be delayed purely because field visits and forest activities were curbed due to movement restrictions and, again, lockdowns in some countries. We've also seen stockpiling of containers, and not just in tropical countries. This has also occurred in the consuming markets, particularly in the larger ports around Europe, UK, China, and even the United States. Again, no employees, no truck drivers, no forklift drivers. So ships are piling up, containers are piling up on the wharf, ships are being held out at sea, and as we speak, Shanghai is currently facing this situation. And only today, ITTO's latest market information report, which is available on the website, warns that China is on the verge of facing a crisis, meaning a distribution crisis. So all the ships that usually use Shanghai are looking for alternative ports now, and there's one that's about a 3-hour sea journey away. This also happened in Europe, where a lot of products were then diverted to smaller ports. Again, smaller ports can only manage so much. That's one thing. Next thing is the employment and the unemployment due to the lack of demand during that period. Which brings me to the topic of sustainable production and consumption. Due to the lack of demand for products, again, factories were downsizing. People were working part-time, they reduced their production levels. So all these were the ugly sides, ugly parts of the pandemic. And what we see now is, at least from ITTO's perspective, having looked at the market information and the experience that our tropical member countries and consuming members have been reporting to us, for as long as we have crises like uglier or stronger variants coming around, either humans need to learn how to live with that, or we will keep repeating this cycle. And that, of course, will then disturb movement towards achieving Sustainable Development Goals. Now, ITTO is also one of the 15 members of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, and it was so encouraging to hear Achim Steiner also say that in order to move forward, also propelled by Helena earlier, we need sustainable financing, and also the data to back that up, to find out actually what is going on the ground. Now, Helena talked about food security, and I talked in an earlier session about having complementary cross-sectoral policies. In other words, agriculture, forestry, mining, infrastructure, these are the main ones that challenge land use. None of these 4 sectors should be enemies. They should complement each other. So if we're talking about smart agriculture, we also need to talk about smart forestry. So in other words, please don't forget the critical importance of natural and production forests. Sustainable forest management lies at the key of that. If the forest provides a value, in other words, if it generates an income that the local communities and that particular country that relies on it as a source of revenue can continue, at least part relying on it, then the forests can be reasonably safe. There will not be that threat to convert it to a far more economically viable land use, which is what we have seen occurring over the last, I don't know how many years, perhaps 50, 60 years, and it continues to occur, particularly in many producing countries. And why is that? Why is that? It's a no-brainer. Answer is very simple. The land use is far more economically viable if they convert it to either farming or agriculture or whatever else. If the forest doesn't generate a value, then we have to be prepared to lose it. And coming from the International Tropical Timber Organization, our members cover 80% of tropical forests globally in all the 3 different regions. And they cover 90% of the trade in forest and non-forest products from legally and sustainably managed forests, which is why I would like to assert that the sustainable production and consumption is incredibly important. International collaboration amongst the CPF partners is also very important. We need to share and manage this knowledge in order to raise awareness at the same pace so that everyone is on the same page. It was said this morning, I mean, it's quite interesting when developed economies like Korea and Japan, they've planted so much, so they have reforested through the landscape approach following World War II. In countries like mine, I come from Malaysia, by the way, in countries like mine and several other tropical countries, during World War II and for at least 3 decades afterwards, the forests provided a refuge for people. They provide shelter and refuge for people to hide in running away from war and conflict. You see how there are 2 different aspects to it. So no
That's great.
one size fits all. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sham. As I said, this is a rather bitty format. We're going to go between actual to virtual here and there. And with that, can I please ask for the video from Patricia Espinosa. Patricia Espinosa is the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC and has some framing remarks for us.
It's a pleasure to join you today from Germany, where springtime is in bloom. Walking through one of the many beautiful forests here reveals multitudes of colors and sounds, showing the rich abundance of life within and reminding us of our deep connection with nature. This connection is easy to forget sometimes, especially as the world is beset with multiple challenges and peaceful solitude is in short supply. Forests, of course, offer more than sanctuary. They support billions of lives, our species, but one of many. They're a foundational part of our biodiversity, they sequester carbon, and they are, above all else, a unique feature of this unique planet upon which we live. Today we are here, in the midst of our great challenges, to discuss the status of the world's forests. Climate change is, because of its intricate link with forests, an essential part of this conversation. The IPCC's 6th assessment report clearly shows that climate change is accelerating and already impacting ecosystems and livelihoods throughout the world. This loss and degradation of ecosystems, including forests, impacts people and nature in multiple ways, above and beyond the immediate loss of habitat, food sources, shelter, resources, and more. It also increases the vulnerability of people to climate change, in particular, indigenous peoples and local communities. On a wider scale, the many challenges associated with ongoing climate change are already seriously impacting food availability and food security in many regions. This has a ripple effect, extending to the global trade of food and agricultural products. In short, these linked problems affect all people in all parts of the world. Rampant deforestation also directly adds to emissions, causing climate change, affecting local climate and reducing the resilience of livelihoods while also impacting biodiversity. It's a harmful, destructive cycle, and all governments, all sectors, and all people need to do more to address it urgently. We have to stop looking for magic bullet solutions. What we must do is difficult but clear. We must make a deep and lasting transformation throughout all sectors of the economy, specifically change the way we produce and consume energy. And we must stop unchecked emissions as soon as possible. Robust ecosystems thriving forests, healthy people, and prosperous economies are incompatible with runaway climate change. To suggest otherwise is a fundamental misunderstanding of science and dangerous to the future of humanity on this planet. We must also focus on the opportunities associated with addressing both climate change and deforestation. For example, if we address deforestation hand in hand while building more sustainable and resilient agricultural systems, we can reduce deforestation while safeguarding food and nutrition security. But let's look beyond that to the bigger picture. This transformational moment in time is our greatest opportunity to meet our Paris Agreement goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century and work towards the cleaner, greener, safer, healthier, and more peaceful world that we all want. That option will quickly vanish if we follow our current trajectory. The good news is that work is already underway to achieve it. We saw this in Glasgow at COP26, where 141 countries endorsed the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use. And we see it in the 54 countries that have taken clear steps to implement REDD+. Of course, nations must do more in numerous areas, but finance is particularly important. Namely, sustained support and international cooperation to implement the REDD+ framework is urgently needed. Why? Because implementing REDD+ is essential in keeping the 1.5 degrees goal possible. I want to thank the Collaborative Partnerships on Forests and the FAO for its excellent work in strengthening cooperation with respect to turning the tide on deforestation. You have been instrumental with respect to driving political momentum and facilitating REDD+ implementation. I want to assure you that UN Climate Change remains committed to continuing and intensifying this work. Ladies and gentlemen, while we still have so far to go to address the destructive cycle of deforestation and climate change and all its associated challenges, we must continue to urge nations to take the necessary steps and boost action in these areas. I wish all of you an excellent and productive Congress, and as we together continue to strengthen our forests, boost climate change action, and build a more sustainable and resilient planet for this and future generations. Thank you very much.
Very good. Tony Simons, that gives us another useful segue. Climate change, but also food insecurity and conflict lead to the displacement of populations. We're already seeing that, and we will see more of it. We have these scary predictions of how many climate refugees there may be by 2030, by 2050. Already, we see in 2020, we saw that there were more than 80 million refugees and IDPs. I wonder if you could put forests in this context for us, if you like, both the negative fallout and the positive role that forests could play in helping to accommodate this flow of people.
Great, thanks James, and thanks to the previous speakers and the video interventions. We live in a world of acronyms. What is CPF, and what is this group called CPF? Well, forestry itself is not an internally, but an internationally displaced topic. In 1992, forestry, along with biodiversity, climate change and desertification, was going to get its own framework convention. A UN framework convention for forestry, fantastic. But we tripped ourselves up, we missed out. And we walked around in the wilderness for a while until 2000, FAO, as the champion, essentially as the foster agency for this orphan called forests, set up the Collaborative Partnership on Forestry. And the Collaborative Partnership on Forestry, which is born out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Forest Advisory Group, is the one that is like the foster parents to that foster agency of FAO. And it's really significant. And it comes back to the inability of countries to negotiate on something that is so important. And that is because some countries have 0% forest cover, and others have 97% forest cover. So it's pretty hard to find agreement on those. And how much of all of the benefits that we get from forests are national public goods, or even local public goods, national public goods, or global public goods? And of course, Gabon doesn't need all of that forest cover that it has. It could quite happily deal with half of it. It would still be 50% more than average forest cover. So if they can't afford to deal with it, the world has to deal with it.
Tony, I'm sorry, could you just have a go at the question? We're really,
Well, I'm
really
coming
pressed.
I'm coming to the question. So 80 million internally displaced people, and we're anticipating climate refugees to be huge. But actually, there's no legal definition for a refugee to do with climate. A refugee is somebody who's persecuted to race, religion, or beliefs. And so we've got to change laws. Governments won't be doing it alone, as they didn't do with forestry. And the problems that we face are often in that rural space. 80 million internally displaced, we've got 2.2 billion people that are going to move from the rural areas to cities by 2050. 2.2 billion. What are we going to be doing with that big number? And it's about geographical displacement. And our forests have been geographically displaced in one direction and people in another. And so coming together, we've got to make sure that it is agencies like the Collaborative Partnership on Forestry. It is looking at why those people are there. Is it due to internal conflict? Is it voluntary? I mean, the number of migrants that have come to Europe over the last 10 years is only 8 million. By 2050, they anticipate that it will be 130 million. The US worry about the 10 million undocumented or unauthorized migrants that they have in their country. It's nothing when we start this huge climate-induced movements and difficulties because we've mismanaged our forest reserve. The things that regulate temperature and water and biodiversity. 85% of biodiversity is inside forests. 92% of terrestrial biomass is inside forests. Why are we missing them up? We've got to come together, not just countries, but corporates, individuals, and civil society. So those figures that we're talking about, 600,000 applications a year for migrant status in the EU, it's nothing. It's nothing at all compared to the huge numbers that will come through degradation of the rural resource base and those movements. And people will stay where they are if they can be incentivized. And incentivize the youth by making youth use technology, being the enumerators of those communities and those forest things, giving them access to land. 75% of forest land in Africa is owned by the government. Maybe the government doesn't want to give it away, but they can give rights and use and access and conditional 30-year leases to people that want to transform and change that. So sorry for taking a while to get to the answer.
It's all valuable, but we are very pressed. We have to be very efficient with our time. Thank you very much, Tony. John, you've kindly been thinking about conflict for us. Can you give us some thoughts on the role, perhaps, that forest research can play in understanding conflicts in and around the forest?
Yeah, I think the role of science is to help shine a light on the underlying causes of conflict by a more, by developing a better understanding of the social and political dynamics of landscapes. And these are of course complex systems, and there are many opportunities for conflicts in such situations in complex landscapes. And what research has been showing, and there's been a lot of very good research, particularly in the last 20 and 30 years, and much of it I should acknowledge C4 and ICRAF for initiating some of this work. some of the major conflicts that, forest-related conflicts, are due primarily to unclear or contested land tenure. This is a major factor. Another particular, another kind of ubiquitous issue in all landscapes, but certainly applies in forested landscapes, power imbalances among community members within a defined area, and also between communities and outside interests, be they agro-businesses or mining, or mining interests, or those associated with illegal logging, who have a lot more power and can easily overcome resistance within communities. And then there's problems such as overlapping jurisdictions over what's above ground and what's below ground. And you see this in a number of areas where communities may have rights to the forests, but the mining ministry may have a say over what happens below ground. This is a recipe for conflict. But overriding or permeating all of these possibilities for conflict is corruption. And corruption is the elephant in the room in the polite discussions that we have in international fora. Many countries have wonderful policies, have signed fantastic international agreements. They have great plans on paper. They have associated regulatory frameworks and robust laws. But corruption, of course, just wipes all of that away, and in many cases just will feed local conflicts over forests. So I'm not sure where to end here, but I think these are some of the factors that have been born out of...
Just end again with a bit of topicality for us. We're looking at a scenario in which climate change is playing into conflict, small and large, and both are having an impact on food insecurity. Are we seeing forest conflicts inside and at the periphery of forests increasing already as a result of these things? And what's the projection?
I don't have any data or any experience to try to answer that, but one would expect that forests, since they're often seen as empty spaces, that they're going to be targeted for exploitation in such situations more than they are today.
Thank you very much indeed. Gertrude, I wonder if you could kindly give us a bit of a sort of closer to the ground perspective on how some of these problems, and perhaps specifically food insecurity, are already impacting forest-dependent communities, and actually how those communities are responding to food insecurity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I'm from the background of indigenous peoples and local communities that depend on forests, and it's their perspectives that I'm going to bring to this discussion. Well, forests and indigenous peoples and local communities that depend on them had what you describe as a loving relationship. They were nurtured by indigenous peoples, and in turn, they would provide food, fiber, building materials to indigenous peoples. Until when governments started owning the forests, that's when the indigenous peoples were evicted from the forests without alternatives. And that was increased over the first UN Sustainable Development Conference in Rio, when indigenous peoples like the Batwa were evicted from the forests. And is it a coincidence that when indigenous peoples were evicted from the forests, the rate of deforestation and forest degradation was accelerated? That's a question I wish to put to the audience. Because when the indigenous peoples were custodians of the forests remained largely intact, with them being sustainably harvested. Now, when governments took over, they threw open forests to corporations, which were increased unsustainable levels of consumption and production, and degraded the environment. As such, the indigenous peoples were exposed to hunger, or exposed to lack. And that's why we demand that we be allowed back into the discussions as equal partners. We have been referred to as stakeholders. No, we are not stakeholders. We are rights holders to the forests. Before we were evicted, we were not even consulted. The forests belonged to us under customary ownership of land. So for that reason, we are demanding that our forests be returned to us, maybe not in the same way that we used to own them, but we want to be part and parcel of the governance of the forests. We don't want to be consulted in a tick-the-box method, but we want our input into the discussions to be used for decision-making. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Gertrude. Abdullah, you're from a country, Bangladesh, that has seen far more than its fair share of all of the problems that we've been discussing, climate-related, conflict-related, migration, forced migration in particular. I wonder if you could tell us something about the effect of that upon Bangladesh's forests and whether youth activism, which you also represent, can play a positive role here.
Thank you. I would like to bring some facts and youth contribution in it. So, as you said about conflict, among 20 vulnerable countries to climate change, 14 of them are involved in conflict. So, I think armed conflict or forced migration are not directly contributing to climate change, but I think it have an indirect influence on the factors like social, environmental, and economic impact. So I have worked with rural communities and also the refugees, vulnerable communities where people have been suffering from the impact of global climate change and which impacted their livelihood, agricultural productivity, ecosystem, and most importantly, the wildlife living on the forest, depending on the forest. So I would like to share, like, while we're talking about conflicts, we're talking about food security in this room, but in some corner, not only in Bangladesh, in some corner of the world, people don't care about climate change, people don't care about food safety, food security, and that's not they don't know about it, they don't know anything about it, so they don't even, they will be able to get their next meal or not. So, they don't have their voice to talk, like about refugees, so they have no places to talking about their problems, their solutions. And if I say about young people's contribution, in here, young people, we are the advocates. So we are able to speak on behalf of those communities, those are left behind, about refugees, about those who are lagging behind. And we will mobilize, we have the power to mobilize them and bring resilience to for our future, and also bring social change. So young people also are innovative and coming up with great solutions for those changes, bring up changes, social changes, and it's also include climate change. And it's very sad for me to say that none of the speakers have mentioned, like, as a solution, youth collaboration to bring solution for a resilient future. But I would like to mention an important role of youth, that we are troublemakers. So if we are not on the same side as you are, you won't be expecting us to be on the other side, because we are not afraid to bring attention to those neglected areas of our societies, and we are not afraid to hold the world leaders to accountable for their actions and for their promises. And young people should be treated as equal partners and stakeholders and also implementers of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. Robert Nassi, good to see you. Thank you for taking the extra effort to be here, given your busy schedule. As you know, we're talking about climate, conflict, food insecurity, and the nexus between the three and how they play out into forests. I wonder if you could, perhaps a little more optimistically, tell us something about the role forests could play in a post-conflict scenario in terms of recovering some degree of stability, providing livelihoods for people. We've seen forests get hammered in so many places where there's conflict. Also, actually, we've seen pressure alleviated on forests as a result of conflict. But either way, the post-conflict scenario is quite different. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Thanks. In fact, you have a few real-life examples of things are happening along these lines. And the one that comes to mind immediately is this area at the frontier between Rwanda, Uganda, and Democratic Republic of Congo, where you have the last mountain gorillas of the Parc National des Volcans, Rwanda, Buindi, impenetrable forest in Uganda, and the Virunga in the DR Congo, and where these three parks that share the last population of mountain gorilla have been working together for probably more than 25 years now, in spite of all the conflicts that have been running in the region. And payments have been made across border, and people, ranger in one of the parks supporting ranger in the other. So it's a very good example of what you can call the park for peace. I mean, it's fundamentally, you use natural resources to create a collective action because everybody benefits, and this continue despite all odds. And I think that the advantage of forest or forest ecosystem is that they can be used for this sort of thing in other configuration. We have, thanks to finance by the European Commission, who have been working on really building, reframing forest governance, and in the DR Congo, in the area of Kisangani, after 15 years of conflict. So I think it's a matter of the forest is there. I mean, it's sort of it's what you want to do for it. Do you want to use it as a support or as a circle for peace, or you want to use it as a place where you hide rebels and things like that? It's very much a question that is left to the people.
Thanks, Robert. And actually, if I can be permitted a very brief anecdote, I'm intrigued when you mention the Virungas, because south of there, where there is the very large Kahuzi-Biega park in eastern Congo, during the long, messy war in Congo of the late 90s, early 2000s, and I was there a great deal, the park authorities and the NGOs working in the park were really the only functioning authority in that area, and actually played rather a positive role in conflict resolution, going far beyond their remit of looking after the park. So it's interesting to know what an organized park system can achieve in an area with otherwise extremely poor governance. Thank you for that, Robert. Let's hear now from the bosses of some of the other CPF organizations. We have a video message, a compilation of video messages from Susan Gardner, the director of the Ecosystems Division at UNEP, Juliet Biao, Kude Nukpo, who's the director of UNFF. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez also has some thoughts for us. He's the Chief Executive Officer and Chairperson of GEF. So if we could please have video compilation 1.
Esteemed partners, colleagues, friends, we all know that there's no way that we can deliver on the Paris Agreement without utilizing the full potential of forests. And we can celebrate the fact that deforestation has slowed down over the last decade, thanks to the work of indigenous people, local communities, countries, and the CPF members here today. However, it's still estimated at a catastrophic 10 million hectares per year, and this has to change. We saw great traction at COP26 with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, and of course UNEP is supportive of the declaration, while at the same time we are mindful that these are some of the same objectives that were already identified on SDG target 15.2 by 2020. So in 2022, we need to see these commitments translated into credible action and transformative change. And we need to see this now to avoid runaway climate change and to curb the worst effects for people. and disasters that are already reinforced by war and the pandemic. We need new approaches to scale up impact. And we can draw on lessons that we already have from other sectors. For example, the great effects that prices and predictable demand have had on decarbonization in the energy sector. For forests, our focus should be on fair forest carbon price that reflects the real costs of conservation and restoration, coupled with predictable demand for forest emission reductions. And to this end, UNEP is supporting the work of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. Funds for result-based payments must be available in enough volume to reward countries that reduce deforestation.
There is growing recognition globally that healthy forests and other ecosystems are vital to protect the planet and building resilience, as they offer solutions for the transformation required to achieve sustainable development. To fully recover from the pandemic and address climate, food, and nature crises, we should reverse the current negative trend of deforestation by placing communities at the center of our efforts to recover better and greener. For this to happen, it is essential for governments, the United Nations system, major group and other partners to take decisive action to integrate forest-based solutions into their immediate and long-term responses and use this opportunity to accelerate action to realize our vision enshrined in the 2030 Agenda and the UN Strategic Plan for Forests. Addressing the greatest crisis before us also offers an opportunity to scale up and invest in forests, thereby assisting us in accelerating progress and transformation toward our shared global goals and commitment. I look forward to seeing many of you during UNFF 17th and discuss how we can join forces and maximize synergies in taking joint actions to address global challenges.
For many decades, nature destructions and forest loss has been one of the main causes of biodiversity loss and has contributed significantly to climate change, land degradation, food insecurity, and poverty, affecting in particular the most vulnerable people living in or depending on forests and natural ecosystems. By considering the real and comprehensive value of forests and by promoting and implementing adequate policy reforms, we can redesign markets and deal with institutional failures that had led to deforestation and forest degradation. The approach needs to be integrated and inclusive to achieve the required transformation of economic systems. The Global Environment Facility has supported sustainable forest management since its inception more than 30 years ago, providing grants to implement projects on the ground in all the developing countries. During the last 4 years, the GEF invested nearly $1.2 billion in forest-related projects. Building on this long experience and thanks to a record pledge of over $5 billion for the next funding cycle, the GEF will increase its support to forests notably through different integrated programs focused on the Amazon, Congo, and critical forest biomes, food systems, ecosystem restoration, and net zero nature positive accelerator.
Great, thank you for all of those submissions. Maria Elena, let's stay with post-conflict scenarios, or if you like, just a scenario where governance is extremely weak, typically associated with a post-conflict scenario. Do we know much about how you prioritize restoration of degraded ecosystem in that environment where you have very, very poor governance, potentially as a result of conflict? Are there any sort of positive points that you can make, or is this a sort of a cry of despair?
Oh, when we have normally conflicts, as you rightly said, we don't have strong governments, and usually the UN, we are there to support the countries, or not to substitute, but to support, because we cannot substitute. And I believe the actions in terms of restoration can bring people back. I don't see that displacement can contribute to restoration, but we should restore to avoid people to leave and to have a more peaceful environment and society. This, as we said in a previous panel, if you have restoration, we can create green jobs, we can create a healthy environment, we can restore soils, and we can multiply the benefits. Invest in $1, we can create $30 of benefit, meaning that if you restore, we can create wealth for people, maybe we can create peaceful societies and avoid displacement and have a peaceful society, and maybe support the governments to become stronger and to have a better governance.
Thank you very much for that. Sham, sort of similar question for you, actually. In a post-conflict scenario for a forest country, the timber industry is maybe one of the first things that they can get going again. Is it possible to do that kind of economic development in really the absence of any kind of reassuringly strong governance? Can the industry be developed perhaps remotely in anything like a sustainable way, sufficiently to give us some assurance?
It's a very difficult question to answer, James. An incredible.
We have you here, Sham.
Well, thank you so much. You put me on the spot. Why not? No, I'm kidding. No, seriously. Generally, with the timber and forest sectors, they're quite organized in most countries. They have a framework within themselves, and some may call it, not so governed or whatever you wish, but in many countries they are. They are. What used to be the case, say, 30, 40 years ago has changed substantially in several developing countries around the world. So it's not a common factor that there is weak governance in every single tropical country on Earth. That's wrong. It's a wrong perception. It's a negative perception.
That's not the perception. We're looking at conflict here and post-conflict.
Sure.
So I'm not thinking of Indonesia. I'm not thinking of Malaysia.
Sure. Oh, well, Malaysia is one, but then, as I did you, I speak for 35 of them, to be quite honest, right? Now, I will tell you now, in my personal opinion, now I don't speak for the organization, I don't think the timber industry can do this alone, because governments themselves are responsible for the governance. If the governance, some form of governance needs to be there. In the absence of governance, people take the law into their own hands. So I don't think I need to say any more, right? And now with the forest industry, the timber and forest industry, sure, there are different ways of doing things, but I honestly do not think that they can do this alone. They need that support, and then they need to involve the people around them. Again, the forest sector or the timber industry sector in many tropical countries are quite different. They're not the same. So it can be that it's a community run, like, for example, the park that you were talking about. Many countries have national parks. They're very well governed and very well protected. But then you also have production forests that have no borders sometimes. So we need to move beyond the conflict and start figuring out how the people of that country can actually manage off their resources in a more sustainable manner. And there are many ways of doing that, of course. Several different ways of doing that. But financing is critical. I think I might have said enough.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Tony, kind of similar question for you. In so many of these discussions, we say, oh, but there needs to be governance, but there needs to be governance. That's what we need. And of course, governance is the last thing that we can whistle up. History of disappointing development progress tells us that. In the absence of strong functioning governance, what role can agroforestry play? And of course, I mean a positive role that's not going to increase the damage to the forests. Are there things that can be done remotely and with a light touch in the absence of strong governance to bring a degree of sustainable economic development through agroforestry.
Indeed, James, and I'll give you a real-life example of that, and it's not an easy country to work in, and that is Papua New Guinea. And we have a new 20 million euro EC finance project there that's starting in a 360,000 hectare conservation area with 22,000 inhabitants and 151 clans. And here we're combining core forest and forest protection with mixed-use forest, home gardens and with agroforestry, and revitalized commercial crops, vanilla, cocoa, coffee, some ornamentals, some botanic oils that are unique, even some new varieties of indigenous ginger and turmeric for the food market. And working with this very diverse group towards kind of enlightened self-interest, of laying out what the prospect is of stewarding your own resources, being in charge of the information and the data, and having the village dashboard and the community dashboard to see that they're the ones that are policing it. Nobody else is policing it. They're policing it on their behalf because they know that if they don't comply or aren't able to provide an assurance, they won't get the benefits that attribute to connecting their conservation efforts with high-value market chains.
Thanks very much indeed, Tony, for that. Let's now have our last video submission. It's a compilation also in 3 parts from Jürgen Vergele, who's the Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, Yvonne Higuero, Secretary General of CITES, and Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who's the Executive Secretary of CBD. Our video compilation 2, please.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to join the dialogue at the World Forestry Congress here in Seoul, Korea, on how forests offer solution to the different global crises we currently face. We at the World Bank are working with countries to implement integrated landscape programs that assess and enhance food systems while delivering these ecosystem benefits, such as carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, and land restoration. These efforts bring together actors across economic sectors and improve outcomes by promoting forest conservation and restoration, by repurposing agricultural food policies, very important, and adopting sustainable agricultural practices that reduce environmental impacts. At the same time, they result in increasing productivity and advanced nature-based solutions and other benefits such as job creation and food security. So this is even more critical as countries rebuild their economies after COVID-19. Now, just one example, in Ethiopia, we support the government through the Sustainable Land Management Program, which has brought 900,000 hectares of land under sustainable management, benefiting more than 2.5 million people. This program has contributed to better water access, less soil erosion, higher crop yields, diversified sources of income, and improved food security, but resulting in more resilient livelihoods and boosting the country's human capital. Now, looking forward, we need to scale up these integrated landscape approaches. We have good examples all over the world, in every region in the world. We need to engage all relevant actors, finance these approaches, and then put in place policies to support them.
In the past years, CITES increasingly has given attention to the major group of indigenous peoples and local communities. It is important to empower and listen to the voices of these communities as we confront the biodiversity and climate change planetary crises. CITES recognizes that the implementation of CITES is better achieved with the engagement of rural communities, and that implementation of CITES listings may enhance livelihoods by delivering long-term species conservation and reducing unsustainable and illegal trade. The CITES resolution on CITES and livelihoods encourages parties to engage rural communities at local, national, and international levels, and also include Indigenous people and local community representatives in their delegations to CITES meetings. CITES seeks to further engage Indigenous peoples and local communities through a working group on Indigenous peoples and local communities, with new guidance on consulting these communities before proposing new CITES listings, and the publication of best practices and lessons learned in the engagement of rural communities. The CITES Secretariat also has developed a CITES and Livelihoods Toolkit and Handbook, which allows for a rapid assessment of how CITES listings impact on the livelihoods of local communities. And finally, the CITES and Livelihoods program explores the best ways that rural communities can benefit from legal trade that supports their livelihoods and the conservation of species.
Ecosystem-based approaches and other nature-based solutions benefit biodiversity and promote and enhance ecosystem services without negatively impacting food production and security. Agroecological approaches such as conservation agriculture, agroforest, crop diversification promote the sustainable use and management of soils and agricultural and food systems while balancing trade-offs between production and protection. Planning for trade-offs should be based on the full recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities who are the caretakers of the forests. As forests and trees can secure genetic diversity and healthy diet, the food system should pay stronger importance to increase the quality and diversity of species and not only focus on increased productivity. Under the impacts of climate change, these options are becoming less feasible or effective as the global average temperatures continue to increase. Investing simultaneously in ecosystems restoration, the rehabilitation of degraded agriculture, pastorands, and the ways to sustainably enhance agricultural productivity can contribute to combating climate change and biodiversity loss and enhance food security at the same time.
Thank you to those speakers too. So we've got about a little bit less than 10 minutes left. This has been a complicated panel because we've been leaping from our panelists to our video submissions, and also because actually of the nature of the conversation. We're trying to reconcile these related but quite different threats to the forest from climate, food insecurity, and conflict. So can I just ask you, please, to try to crystallize things for us a little bit as we come to a conclusion. I'd just like to go down the table, starting with Robert. And I'd like you to all name quite crisply, in a minute, 2 minutes if you must, something that you worry about most when you think of this rising portfolio of risks. Climate risks related, conflict risks related, food insecurity. These three risks to the forest, and then also something that gives you a little bit of hope. What's something that you worry about most or particularly, and something that gives you a little bit of hope?
I would say my main worry now will be crossing the tipping point in terms of the Amazon, because if we do that, and if, as forecast, the Amazon becomes a savanna within the next 20 years, that will trigger another cascade of tipping points, and then we are in deep problem. And my optimism is the fact that there are also some social tipping points that could be triggered, and that could help avoid that we trigger the planetary tipping point. And it's a matter of collective action.
Thank you very much, Robert. Maria Elena, same questions.
What I maybe say that it's difficult to separate the crisis. And to me, what worries me is the amplitude of the crisis and the new ones coming, and our incapacity to prevent. The pandemic we couldn't prevent, maybe the Ukraine, the conflict, I don't know, we couldn't prevent the extension. Now, what is positive is, I think forests could be part of the solution in terms of the crisis, in terms of food security. And what gives me hope is the coordination and the cooperation. We could see in this panel that we are all aligned and all the world is trying to work together, because we could see that we don't have individual solution. The solution has to be a common solution, everybody should be part, and to include youth, women, and indigenous people. They have to be also part of the solution.
Thank you very much for that. Sham.
Thank you, James. For me, I feel as if the thing that worries me the most is that tropical forestry is still being taken for granted in one way, and it's not being focused enough upon sufficiently. This is why you still see the dramatic rates of deforestation happening in tropical countries. In some, maybe not, and as Robert is saying, the Amazon is the biggest fear. The second thing that I worry about is that the climate and forest naturally sit together. So why is it that everybody is talking about nature-based solutions, but we don't see enough of that being operationalized, meaning increasing the use of wood products? You know, sustainably harvesting timber from a sustainably managed forest is not deforestation. That is wood security. It is a natural, most environmentally friendly construction material. It can be used with others, of course, because we will never have enough trees in the world for every construction to be made out of 100% of wood. So that there is no problem in mixing of materials, but wood materials should be given and awarded the value that they deserve. This feeds into the Collaborative Partnership on Forest Work, particularly the Sustainable Wood for a Sustainable World initiative. That needs to be ramped up, you know. And the last thing that I just wish to mention here, which I think a lot of us are also very concerned about, but not many people dare to talk about it, the current conflict that's going on between Russia and Ukraine. If it carries on at the state that it is going right now, we will see an extension of Syria, an extension of whatever used to happen in all the conflict-ridden countries. And the worst scare is we will see, again, natural resources being destroyed. Many parts of Ukraine are already destroyed right now. There is a ban on the use of Russian wood resources in many countries, also gas and fuel. So this will then place far more threats on existing resources, and countries will have to adapt very quickly. We are already seeing that in terms of all the economic sanctions that they're placing. Now, placing the economic sanctions is one thing because you're punishing the people who are linked with the regime that is alleged to be carrying out all these atrocities. But in the meantime, you need to find those resources in an alternative place or find alternative resources. And when crises hit, sometimes mankind can't move fast enough. So I worry about that. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sham. Tony, a fear and a hope.
A fear is we still confuse the price, the cost, and the value of forests. And at the low end, treating them just as carbon. But the Boston Consulting Group came out with a great report on an estimate of $150 trillion. Now, whether that is accurate or not, it shines a light on the fact that that's twice the size of the world stock markets. Well, soon going to be 3 times the size of the world stock markets. And yet we just kind of ignored it. It just fades and the attention is not there. What gives me hope is not forest particularly, but environmental crime. At the moment, there's only 4 real environmental crimes, and those are illegal logging, illegal mining, illicit wildlife trade, and waste dumping. But with the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosures, the Green Finance Institute starting up in London, we are going to see deforestation, loss of biodiversity, degrading land, unabated emissions as an environmental crime, and legislation to punish and sanction and direct change around that. And that gives me real hope that we will not use these as an instrument of exploitation, but use them as a greater instrument to drive prosperity for communities and also wealth for the enterprises associated with forests.
Thank you very much for that. John?
Ooh, tough question. Well, there's plenty to be fearful about, and we've heard...
No shortage.
In fact, I think it's added actually to my own fears. If I could add one, I think what worries me the most is the inability of governments to break down silos and coordinate policies across sectors. So those sectors that have been continuing to drive deforestation and degradation are not being brought into line through unified policies, at the government, at national government levels. So I think this is a continuing problem. And associated with that are the subsidies that go to sectors that are killing us, quite frankly. What I'm a little bit optimistic about is the fact that a larger proportion of the general public is really worried as well. And I think if that can be translated into some action, political action, and action in terms of patterns of consumption, I think this is hopeful.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Gertrude, same question to you. Something that worries you particularly and something that gives you a little bit of hope.
What worries me most is that we are looking in the wrong places for the solutions to food insecurity. Food insecurity is not a question of production. Food insecurity is political. It's a question of justice, of democracy, and political will. And as long as we continue to exclude or unfairly include indigenous peoples and local communities, we are not going to solve any problem. So what gives me a lot of hope is that there are indigenous communities and the local communities, the local communities and indigenous peoples are willing to come to the discussions, are available, and they have never abandoned the forest. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Abdullah, I think you're going to get the last word. Same question.
Thank you. As it is the concern of our future you're talking about, so I'm very concerned about all the crises. And this is our future. But mostly I will be concerned about global climate change and natural resource management because resources are limited and we have to use those resources when we will get old and also for our future generation. We have to keep it. But a little hope that the youth are not sitting idle. We are taking our own initiatives and we are doing something more. And as a leader of one of the largest youth association, we are also taking some initiative as a village concept projects that is a largest scale development projects with a measurable impacts on SDGs. We are taking initiatives for no food waste, women in agriculture, and also a joint collaborative initiative with FAO, that Youth for Climate Resilience in Agriculture. And also you'd be happy to see that like in Dominican Republic of Congo, we are also doing a project named Food for Forestry. So this is an initiative that is like efficient use of natural resources and also economically beneficial initiative. So we youth have a lot of projects to work with. So lastly, I would like to ask you to come forward and support youth-led initiatives. And as a leader of youth association, we have I'm urging you to invest on young people, and we have a lot of projects to work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Abdullah. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. As promised, 15 speakers plus me in 90 minutes, which is really not a bad helping, and we've almost finished on time. Thank you very much for really boldly entering into quite a difficult, bitty conversation to our panelists here. Please join me in thanking them. Robert, Maria Elena, Sham, Tony, John, Gertrude and Abdullah.
Congratulations. So well.
Thank you.
James.